Most people think they already know the important stories about America's presidents. We hear about their policies, their speeches, their achievements. But when you start looking into the families they came from, the picture changes in ways you don't expect. Some presidents had relatives whose lives were kept quietly in the background. Some had connections that didn't fit the clean public image they showed the country. And some carried family histories that stayed out of sight for decades, only coming to light long after they were gone. In this video, we're taking a closer look at the personal stories behind several presidents and the family secrets that reveal a very different side of who they were. Most people know Thomas Jefferson as the author of the Declaration and one of America's founders. But behind that familiar image was a private story that stayed out of sight for a very long time. During his years at Monticello, Jefferson lived alongside the Hemings family, a large mixed-race enslaved family that was deeply connected to the Jefferson household. The most well-known among them was Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman who, by all evidence, had a long-term relationship with Jefferson that resulted in several children. What many people may not know is that Sally Hemings was not just another enslaved person at Monticello. She was actually the half-sister of Jefferson's wife, Martha. Both women shared the same father, a Virginia landowner. For nearly 2 centuries, the truth sat in a strange place between rumor and possibility. Some historians dismissed the story, others argued for it, and both sides claimed the evidence was on their side. The debate continued until 1998, when DNA testing connected the Jefferson male line to Eston Hemings, one of Sally's youngest sons. While DNA can't identify Thomas Jefferson individually, the timing, records, and historical context all point in his direction. Today, most scholars agree that Jefferson was almost certainly the father. Jefferson's own actions add weight to that conclusion. He never mentioned the children in his letters, but he made choices that stood out. Sally's children were given privileges not allowed to other enslaved people at Monticello. They were allowed to live and work in different parts of the estate, and each of them eventually gained their freedom, something Jefferson rarely granted. It suggests he quietly acknowledged them, even if he never did so publicly. Andrew Jackson is often remembered as a tough, forceful president, but his personal life included a family story that many people have never heard, and it adds a surprising twist to the legacy of a man known for pushing native tribes off their land. During the Creek War, Jackson found a young native boy on a battlefield. The child's family had been killed, and Jackson took him in, naming him Lincoln. Jackson brought the boy back to his home in Tennessee, raised him alongside his other children, and treated him as part of the household. But while Jackson was raising a native child in his own home, he was also shaping government policy that forced thousands of native families from their homelands. Years later, as president, Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, the law that led to the Trail of Tears, a deadly journey that displaced entire tribes and caused the deaths of thousands. That contrast is what makes Jackson's story so unusual. On one side, he showed personal compassion to a native child he rescued. On the other, he supported national policies that devastated native nations on a massive scale. Historians still debate how Jackson saw this contradiction. Some suggest he believed he was doing the best he could for a child with nowhere else to go. Others argue he didn't see individual relationships and national policy as connected. Lincoln never lived to see adulthood. He died as a teenager, most likely from illness. Jackson was said to be genuinely saddened by the loss. Ulysses S. Grant is remembered as the general who helped win the Civil War and later became president. But his own family story sits in a strange and uncomfortable place between slavery and financial scandal. Before the war, Grant struggled to support his family. During that time, his father-in-law, who was a wealthy slaveholder, gave Grant control of an enslaved man named William Jones. Grant used Jones' labor for a short period, but something unusual happened next. Instead of selling Jones for much-needed money, something many men in Grant's situation would have done, Grant signed legal papers to free him. Grant's decision confused some people around him because his family was in desperate financial trouble. Still, he chose to give Jones his freedom, even though he could have earned a significant sum by selling him. But the deeper family secret came later, not from Grant himself, but from his relatives. After the war, Grant's father and brothers became involved in a financial scheme connected to Wall Street speculators Jay Gould and James Fisk. Their plan was to manipulate the gold market, and they used Grant's name and position to look more credible, even though Grant wasn't personally involved. The scheme eventually collapsed, causing economic panic and embarrassing Grant publicly. Grant was furious when he learned that his family had used their connection to him in a shady financial operation. It made him look corrupt, even though he hadn't taken part in the plan or benefited from it. The scandal showed how easily his family's actions could damage his reputation, especially at a time when he was still trying to prove himself as president. Harry S. Truman built his reputation on being direct, honest, and grounded. But his family background wasn't nearly as straightforward as the public image he later carried. Long before he became president, Truman's world was shaped by Kansas City politics, a place where everyday life, local power, and organized crime often overlapped. In the early 1900s, Kansas City was heavily influenced by the Pendergast political machine, a network that controlled elections, handed out jobs, and looked the other way at illegal activities like gambling and bootlegging. Truman wasn't part of the criminal operations, but he did get his political start with Pendergast's support. In that era, it was almost impossible to run for office in Kansas City without going through that system. Where the story becomes more personal is with Truman's extended family. Some of his relatives worked in areas where the line between legal and illegal wasn't always clear. They had connections to people involved in gambling and other activities linked to the city's criminal side. These weren't mafia-level ties, but they were close enough that Truman sometimes had to worry about how their behavior might reflect on him. Truman tried hard to keep his distance from that world. He avoided talking about it, kept certain relatives out of political conversations, and focused on building a clean reputation of his own. But he couldn't completely escape it because Kansas City politics and the people in it had helped him get his start. Even when he reached national office, reporters occasionally brought up his old connections, and Truman would become tense or defensive whenever the topic came up. Theodore Roosevelt is often remembered as a bold, confident president who seemed larger than life. But behind that energetic public image was a family story he rarely spoke about, a story centered on his younger brother, Elliott Roosevelt, whose life was marked with trouble from the very beginning. Elliott struggled with alcohol from a young age. His drinking led to reckless behavior, financial problems, and a growing sense that he couldn't manage his own life. As the Roosevelt family's reputation grew, Elliott's actions became harder to hide. There were reports of explosive arguments, unpredictable behavior, and even accusations related to his treatment of women, issues that would have caused a major scandal if they had become widely known. Theodore, whose own career was gaining attention, spent years quietly trying to protect his brother. He helped manage Elliott's finances, stepped in when situations got out of control, and tried to guide him toward stability. But Elliott's struggles only grew worse. Eventually, the family placed him under care, and his downward spiral ended tragically when he died in his early 30s. The story becomes even more complicated when you realize who Elliott's daughter was, Eleanor Roosevelt, the future First Lady. As a child, she witnessed much of the turmoil surrounding her father, and it shaped her life in ways she later spoke about openly. Theodore rarely discussed Elliott publicly. His silence wasn't surprising. The Roosevelts were a prominent family, and revealing the full truth would have drawn unwanted attention at a time when Theodore's political career was rising. Protecting the family name mattered, and Theodore took that role seriously. George Bush came from a successful and influential family, but one part of that history has followed the Bush name for decades. It centers on his father, Prescott Bush, a well-connected banker and businessman who built his career in the years leading up to World War II. Some of Prescott's business dealings have raised questions ever since, partly because of the companies he worked with and the timing of those connections. Before the war, Prescott Bush was involved with financial institutions that had investments in businesses operating in Germany. At that time, the political situation in Europe was changing quickly, and some of those companies were later linked to the early stages of the Nazi regime. The Bush family did not control those companies, and Prescott did not personally support Nazi ideas, but the fact that his business ties overlapped with such a dark moment in history became a point of controversy years later. Most of these connections were simply the result of international business networks that existed before the world understood what Germany was turning into. But once the war began and the full scope of Nazi actions became known, any association, even an indirect one, looked troubling. Some historians believe Prescott was caught in circumstances he didn't fully understand. Others argue that American companies in general were too slow to cut ties with Germany as events unfolded. As George Bush rose in politics, reporters occasionally brought up his father's business history, often in ways that made it sound more dramatic than it really was. The younger Bush was not involved in any of it. He was a child at the time, but he still had to deal with questions about decisions made long before he entered public life. This part of the Bush family story isn't a scandal in the traditional sense, but it sits in an uncomfortable place. It shows how connections from one generation can become challenges for the next. Jimmy Carter is often remembered as a soft-spoken, thoughtful president, but the world he grew up in was very different from the one he later tried to represent. Carter was raised in rural Georgia at a time when segregation shaped almost every part of life, and his own family carried beliefs and traditions that he would eventually spend years trying to move away from. Carter's father, Earl Carter, was a respected local businessman, but also a strong supporter of segregationist politics. He believed in maintaining the racial traditions of the South, and he made those views clear in the way he ran his businesses and raised his family. Carter grew up surrounded by neighbors, relatives, and community leaders who all believed the same things. But Carter didn't stay that way. As he grew older, he began to question the beliefs he had inherited. He worked alongside black farm workers on his family's land, got to know them personally, and began seeing the deep unfairness built into his behavior and Carter's own household. While he was moving toward ideas of fairness and equal rights, some of his family members continued to support the old system. They didn't always understand why Carter was so outspoken, especially when he entered politics and publicly challenged the racial attitudes many in his hometown still held. Carter's story shows a quieter kind of family secret, not one involving scandal or personal drama, but a legacy of beliefs he had to unlearn. It's a reminder that sometimes the hardest part of a president's story is the distance between the world they come from and the world they want to build.